Welcome back. All right, I want to talk about scheduling today because why not? And I want to talk about it from an expansion standpoint. And this gets tricky. So, the NHL looking at the possibility of going to Salt Lake City. So, I'm wearing Kansas City to kind of symbolize Salt Lake City. I've got a Kansas City magnet on the board here. I've also got a Thrashers magnet because there's been all that talk about Atlanta as well. But it gets tough when you're trying to figure out scheduling. And so I used to, way back in the day, I had my own league of players and I would schedule my own schedule. What I found was 40 worked. So I'm going to talk about 40, but we'll get there. And I know people are going to be like, "Oh my gosh, no, I'm not saying they go to 40." I'm not saying that. Just I found that with 40 it worked the best. So at 34 teams it gets difficult cuz trying to figure out a matrix, good luck because it's going to be different with one division than the other because you have a division with 9 teams. Otherwise, you can make it work. If you had the setup that we had, let's say one extra team's added, you could make it work. Where you'd have 4 against your division, 3 against the other division, and then with 17 teams in the other division, you play each 2 times. You end up with an 86 game schedule. There you go, done. Works out great, right? The odds are we're going to see it. I would think the schedule goes to 84. There's been rumblings of that for a while, right? But trying to make a matrix for the schedule work with 17 teams in each conference is a bit of a nightmare. One thing that I've talked about before, and I don't think the NHL will ever do this again, is the idea of almost a baseball model where you would just play the West, you would just play the East, you'd have a little bit of crossover. The closest we got to that in the NHL was, I want to say 20 years ago, when we had where you only played the other conference once per season. But where owners got mad at that was that means that if you're the Vancouver Canucks, you're only going to get Toronto every 2 years. You're only going to get Boston every 2 years. You're only going to get Montreal every 2 years. That doesn't work for Gates. So if you're going to tell an owner, hey, you're not going to get Montreal this year, but you get Kansas City, I don't think that an owner in Vancouver would be happy with that. So there are ways to maybe work around that where you could have a rivalry in the other conference that you want to highlight. Maybe you have a home and home with teams in the other conference. But again, it would be like baseball. You'd have to kind of rotate it. Once you get past 32 teams, it is very difficult to manage where every team plays each other twice and have a balanced schedule. Now, one of the reasons I have this set up the way that I do is because I think you kind of have to get rid of divisions. If you get rid of divisions, look at this. You play against your own conference 3 times each. You play the other conference twice, 48, because 3 times 16 is 48, 2 times 17 is 34. You add those two numbers together, you got an 82 game schedule. Bam. Just get rid of divisions. I've seen people talking about divisions, and I wish we go back to the old names for divisions. I'd kind of like to see 2 conferences. I'd actually like to see the divisions taken out of the question. You're going to have more rivalries this way. You're going to have a situation where you don't want to give that other team points at all. Most of your games, you're not going to want those games to go to overtime. I think you'd see more competitive hockey. I do think we would have. We've already seen trading in the division. I don't think it would necessarily affect trades so much, but I do think it'd be a lot of fun to have where you're playing every other team 3 times. And I mean, rivalries will still exist, geographical rivalries. I know there's people who won't like it, but yeah. And then you've got the 34 games against the other conference, so you play the other conference twice, right? So you've kind of got a situation here where you're going to see everybody almost equal. And so you shouldn't be complaining as much about, well, this team had a much easier schedule than this team. You're still going to have back-to-backs. You're still going to have travel. You're going to have situations where one team might have an easier schedule, but it shouldn't be that dramatic of an easier schedule. Now, if you want to get really dramatic with how you're going to do this, and again, with no divisions, it kind of works. You can have 4 games against each team in your conference. So that'd be 64 games against teams in your conference. 4 times against all 16 of them. And then 18 games against the other conference. So this setup here where you play each team in your own conference 4 times, I personally prefer that. I do. And I know people are going to be like, why? I think that works. I think you're building really solid rivalries in each conference. Just imagine a setup where Florida sees Tampa 4 times, but they see Carolina 4 times, Washington, Montreal. All these teams are going to see each other 4 times. Metro Division gone, Atlantic Division gone. Boston could have a great rivalry with the Rangers. They play each other 4 times a year. I think it could work. And again, it kind of feels like baseball. And then the best part is people get the playoffs back. You get your 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, 3 versus 6, and 4 versus 5. I am greatly opposed to the idea of expanding the playoffs. I like the idea of the playoffs, making the playoffs being difficult and having to have a really good team in order to make the playoffs. So I'm not in favor of expanding the playoffs beyond where they are right now. And then there's the question of, are we eventually going to get to 36? So at 34 teams, it's difficult, but with 36 teams, it can work. So again, let's say we have divisions. So you have 8 teams in your division you have to play against. Let's say you play them 4 times. You play against your own conference 3 times, that's 27 games, and then against the other conference once. Once per team, that equals 87 games. So again, you get enough games. You could obviously drop a few of the games there, but I don't know that owners would sign on to that. The one question I have is, if the league expands much further, are the NHL owners going to still say, we want every single team coming into our barn? Because once you get up to 34, 36, you're already looking at, in a 34 team league, if every team plays each other twice, that's a 68 game schedule. 66, because you're playing against the other 33 teams twice each. You don't play against yourself. So that's 66 games right there. And then you've got 16 others that you could make for division rivalries, or you could make them for geographical rivalries. There's the other option too. I've seen people talk about, well, why do we have conferences at all? Why don't we have 1 versus 16? That's the kind of chaos I can't see NHL owners going for. It's also something I don't think they'd like from a travel perspective, and I don't think broadcasters would like it either. I think broadcasters, what's been shown is that they really like the rivalries. They really like to have those matchups. So if they like the rivalries with the 36 teams and with as many games as you're going to have against a rival, the setup where it's 4 games against each team, I think works best for broadcasters. And again, if you're trying to improve your ratings south of the border, this can work. Now, if you want to improve your ratings in Canada, that's where I think you end up going to 40 or at least 36. But I've just got 34 on the board. I didn't decide to put up like Quebec and Hartford or anything like that. Although Quebec and Hartford would both be on this side, right? So then you got to come up with, you'd have Houston on this side and, I don't know, Milwaukee, maybe, right? So it does get tough to figure all this out. Obviously, with this setup where you wouldn't have divisions, you're going to have more travel for some teams. Vancouver, though, the travel was always the thing with Vancouver back in the way back days, like 1980 and 1981, when the NHL had a balanced schedule. So when the WHA teams first came in and we had 21 teams in the NHL, well, you play the other 20 teams in the league 4 times. That's it. Play every team 4 times. Vancouver was really an island, though. They didn't have anybody to visit that was anywhere nearby. That's changed. You now have Seattle. Vegas isn't that far, like in terms of a flight, comparatively speaking, with places like Detroit, Montreal, Toronto, and whatnot, even Chicago. So I do think this can work. And I do think this is something that the NHL should be proactive in trying to figure out as soon as they can, if they're really going to do this, right? So if you're going to have, say, 34 teams in the league in 2030, then get the matrix all figured out. And if they want some help, hey, I'm willing to volunteer to help. I think this is fascinating. I was coming up with my own schedules when I was a teenager, so no problem. I even figured out with 40 teams, you can come up with a matrix that works. Now, I'd be putting myself into basically Hades, because the way that it worked was that every team played or every team didn't. So, and I can't see the NHL actually doing that, but it worked where I had, and I don't have that matrix. I could probably come up with it again, because I've had people ask me and say, what was your how did you do that with 40 teams? I can probably come up with it again. But you'd have to have 8 5-team divisions. I know I had that. Against your own division 4 times, and then you're against everybody else in the league twice. So it adds up 16 plus 30 plus 40. it's an 86 game schedule that way. That is one of the things too. If you're going to expand the schedule to say 84 or 86 games, pretty sure the NHLPA has to sign off on that. I don't know how anxious they would be for that, but it is one of those problems we don't have with a 32 team league. 32 team league, it works. Now, you have setups where you're against your own divisional opponent 3 or 4 times, but that leads to a lot of whining. Like, I have heard so much whining over the last few years about, it's so sad. The Rangers and the Islanders only play each other 3 times this year instead of 4. It's an 82 game schedule. If that one extra game in an 82 game schedule is that big of a difference, I don't know what to tell you. I don't even really notice until I'm doing previews whether or not a team's played each other 3 times or 4 times during a season. And I think it's likely we continue to see that where it's 3 or 4 times, 3 against the conference, and then it drops to once against the other conference. As long as the NHL is demanding that every team visit every other team's arena as they expand, it's going to get tougher and tougher to keep divisions as is without going to, as I've got here, a conference model. I think a conference model works better. So the question I have for people is, if the NHL went to just 2 conferences, divisions are gone, you play against the teams in your conference the same amount of times. Ideally, the reason that I like the 4 is you have 2 games in Colorado if you're Vancouver and 2 games in Vancouver. You don't have a setup where a team has home ice advantage on you because you have 2 games in their barn and they only have 1 game in yours. That is the one thing where I can see playing 3 times against a team being maybe a bit of a difference maker, right? But I'd be interested to know your thoughts. What do you think would work? And again, I'm not getting into whether or not they should expand, just if/when they do. How do you think the schedule is going to work? How do you think it should work? And do you think there's a point where NHL owners would ever say, you know what, we'll just play the other conference once? And then, focus on those rivalries. Those rivalries are really, really important. I think it's more important for Seattle to build a really strong rivalry with Vancouver and Vegas and Edmonton rather than make sure that Florida comes to visit or Detroit comes to visit or Washington comes to visit once a year. Like, I think the priority should be those rivalry matchups, the ones that are going to sell tickets, those really big name items. There are examples of teams in one conference that has a rivalry with a team in another. Again, for Vancouver to be any of the Canadian teams on this side, like Chicago and Detroit have had a long rivalry. And I mean, obviously, Boston has somewhat of a rivalry with Vancouver, I think, right? We all remember that final. So it's not perfect. It's not a perfect solution. I don't think there is one, but let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. How would you want to see this scheduled? And if we went to 36 teams, if they went all the way to 40, that kind of thing, just let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And I've only got 40 on the board because I did 40 teams, and it worked pretty well. But again, I didn't have to actually have National Hockey League level players. I could just create new names, and there you go, got a brand new team. Can't do that with the NHL. I guess they could try, but they've tried that at the draft once, but that's a Buffalo story from a long, long time ago. And that was just, I don't know who we're going to draft. Let's just make a guy up. So anyways, there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And hey, I just thought this was a fun video idea, looking at how would scheduling work, because I think scheduling's fun, because fundamentally there has to be something wrong with me. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.